So we're going to go back through here because I have some more information for you from last week where we were talking about, and then we're going to do all the other people. So we're going to finish this today. I did have some more information about Phoebe that I wanted to share with you. And I haven't changed the PowerPoint. So just remember, she was a servant of the church at Cenchrea. And I showed you Cenchrea, and it was close to Corinth. And Paul was staying at Corinth at the house of Gaius. And this is where he was writing the book of Romans at the end of the third missionary journey. And I told you that she was a servant of the church. And in the Greek word, diakonon, it means servant, and then later on, this same word, you can almost hear the word deacon there, right? And so many people say Phoebe was a deaconess. Well, she wasn't. She was just a servant because of this little fact here. Every deacon is a servant, but not every servant is a deacon, okay? We're all servants of the church. We should be, but deacon is a special calling for men. And that's in Timothy and Titus, and we won't go there and look at all that. But anyway, that's what Phoebe was. And then he says, he's writing this to the people in Rome now. He said, receive her in the Lord as becoming saints, and assist her in whatsoever business she hath need of you, for she hath been a succorer of many, and of myself also. Now that word is, we don't use this word anymore, succorer, very archaic word. So what does it mean? It's someone who provides aid, relief, or assistance to others during time of distress or difficulty or hardship. It is archaic, but is a powerful term for a helper or a rescuer or a caregiver. And another really good synonym, a synonym means a word that kind of means the same, but a little more modern word would be a benefactor. A person or organization that provides help, support, financial assistance to another individual or a charity or a cause. And these words come from the Latin. And remember, they would have been speaking Latin in Rome, right, where she was going. It literally means one who does good deeds. And the synonyms there, another word we would use today would be a patron or a sponsor. We kind of use those words today. So Phoebe was probably a supporter of Paul. You know, there were several people that supported him, and she was probably a lady of means, you know. In other words, she had money and she was able to support his missionary work. Now, the picture I used last week, the reason I didn't like it was because she looked too young to me. I think of her, and I found this picture, and I said, I think of her being more like in her 40s. Because if she's a person of means, you got to have time to get that money. Or maybe she was a widow, you know. Maybe she was a widow, and maybe her husband had been wealthy. Or maybe, you know, there's like a million scenarios. But for sure, I think she would be a lady of means because, you know, to make this trip, it's not like Paul gave her the money and said, here, you go to Rome. She had to do all that on her own, right? So she had to be able to afford to do that. So, and if she was a person of means, it is very likely that she took somebody with her. You know, you are all asking me if she was all by herself. Maybe she had another family member. Maybe she had even a son or a nephew. Or maybe she just had a servant. People of means in that time, they had servants. That's just the way of life back. That doesn't mean they were slaves. It doesn't mean they were mistreated. But she could have had a trusted servant that went with her. We just don't know because it's not mentioned. Okay. But this is when we read the Bible. I thought of this week, and I wanted to pass it on to you. And it's always very important to remember. The Bible is a history. The Bible is not a history book, okay? But everything the Bible says is historically accurate. So if the Bible said it, that means it's accurate. But the Bible is not a history book, meaning it does not record everything, okay? If it did, it would be bigger than this room. So basically, the details that are recorded in the Bible are what we have to have for the story. All the details of Phoebe and her life, we don't know. Okay? If I was a movie producer like George Lucas, I think it would be great to take Phoebe and make a whole movie out of it. But you'd have to add your own stuff, and basically that's what they do in the TV series The Chosen, right? They add backstories and things, and some people like that, and some people say that's not in the Bible. Well, no, it's not in the Bible, but it could have been true, but we don't know. So you can make all kind of backstory for Phoebe. You say, well, this could be true, but it might not be true. We simply don't know. But we do know that she was some kind of benefactor, supported Paul, supported his work, and was very reliable enough to, that he knew that she could get that letter over to Rome, or he wouldn't have given it to her. I showed you this ship. Sorry, we're not supposed to use the word boat. Last week, but I found another picture. This is kind of this is not a real, this is like a artist rendition kind of picture. But they did say that these merchant ships always had the big square sail, and they always were controlled with two oars on the front. There's one on this side too. So they didn't have a rudder like the modern ships. They had these oars. And basically, in here, they would have had the people controlling the oars probably would have been slaves, Roman slaves. And usually here on the front was some animal, or sometimes it was a Roman god or something. And down in the hold, down in here, was where they had the cargo, which was often it was grain or whatever. These are merchant ships. But then they would also take passengers, and the passengers had to stay up on the deck. Okay, and they said the passengers always brought some kind of tent thing because you're out in the sun all day, every day. Just think what it would be like to go on a boat like that and take a voyage, and there's no bathroom, and you'd have to bring your own food and your own water. That would be a very hard voyage, So just think all that through. Not an easy thing. And what I don't know is how long it would take to do this. I probably should have looked that up, but I would say a couple of days at least. I guess it would depend upon the wind and how the wind was blowing, you know. But I would say at least 2 or 3 days and maybe longer. I should have looked that up for you. So now we're going to go on to the others, which I just barely mentioned last week, but I have more information on them this week, okay? Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my helpers in Christ Jesus, who have for my life laid down their own necks. So in other words, they saved Paul's life at some point. Unto whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Likewise, greet the church that is in their house. So they had a house church in their house. So either they were providing the house, for the people, or it's possible that Aquila might have been acting as the pastor, because he was very learned. Or maybe he wasn't the pastor, maybe they just provided the place, because they didn't have churches like this, okay? They didn't have that until way later when the Catholics started building the great big edifices that they had. So now where do they come from? I don't know if you remember their story, but I just put the verses in here from Acts so you could really understand Priscilla and Aquila. From Acts 18, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. So at Corinth, he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy. That would be from Rome, right? With his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. Now, Claudius was the emperor at that time, and he had expelled the Jews. So that's why they left. They left Italy and they ended up in Corinth. And that's how they met Paul. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them. In other words, he stayed with them in their house, wherever they were staying. And he wrought, or that's also kind of an archaic word. It means he worked. For by their occupation they were tent makers. So they made tents, which was probably something much used in that time, because people did not have as stable homes as we have. They were always moving, they were always here and there, and I think a lot of people lived in tents, and so that was something that was much needed at that time. And Paul also knew how to do that. So I just had a few pictures here with, of course, these are artist renditions. You have to always keep that in mind. Of Paul in their home, or it's probably a rented place, but it is still their home for the time. And they have opened it up to him to stay there with them. These would be not big dwelling places, Don't think it's some massive thing. They were just willing to have him there because he did. Paul is depending upon people like this because he doesn't have a home or anything. He's traveling on these missionary journeys. So he's just trusting the Lord that God will put people in his path that will let him stay with them and that will have the means to be able to give him some food and things like that. He depended upon that very much. And Priscilla and Aquila were two of the people. Continuing on here in Acts, just so you know everything they did and why they were so important to him, it says, Paul, after this, tarried a good while, and then he took his leave of the brethren and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. Now, this is in Acts, okay? Having shorn or shaved his head in Cenchrea. Remember, that is where Phoebe was, where he had a vow. So in Cenchrea, that's where Phoebe was, if you remember. And at this time, a certain Jew named Apollos, who was born at Alexandria, that's in Egypt, was a very eloquent man. In other words, he was a very good speaker. Have you ever heard people who were a speaker and they just had an amazing voice, or like a big booming voice? And mighty in the scriptures came to Ephesus, and this man was instructed in the way of the Lord, being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. But his knowledge was very lacking. All he knew was what John had taught. Okay? So even though he was probably had a lot of zeal and he was a loud preacher, wow, all he knew was John. But instead of saying, well, that guy there, he doesn't know very much. All he knows is John. Instead of that, Priscilla and Aquila said, you know what? He's a great teacher. He has so much potential. Let's take him in and teach him what he has to know so that he'll be better. And that's what they did. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. In other words, they're hearing him talking. They're like, this guy is a great speaker, but he doesn't know so much. We have to teach him. So Priscilla and Aquila had Bible college in their house, and they're teaching now Apollos. Okay? so that he can go and see. They don't want to like kick him to the side. They want to say, yeah, we want to help him. And he was disposed to pass in Achaia. The brethren wrote, exhorting, okay, all that. Let's skip down to here. He mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. So after they taught him a while, now what is he able to do? Now he's also preaching Jesus, not just the baptism of John. So you see how they helped him? So I would say they were very integral to the work that Paul was doing. Because see, Paul's only one person. He can only be in one place at a time. So he needs people like Priscilla and Aquila who are in other places, who are teaching and training people. So that's why he was so fond of Priscilla and Aquila. So I just wanted to show you these verses so you can know, and maybe you have read about them before, but anyway, I'm just trying to, bring it all together for you. So I just wrote this little thing. They were students of Paul, obviously, they knew him. But then they were, and I'm trying to use S words, okay? They were scholars because they taught Apollos. I couldn't think of another word for a teacher that started with an S. And then they sacrificed to help Paul in the cause of the gospel. I would assume that, they had him in their home, so they supported him while he was there. But he also said that they literally laid down their neck for him. That is a kind of an archaic way of saying that at some point they saved his life. Somehow they risked their life for him. So they sacrificed. I'm sure they sacrificed financially, but they also were willing to risk their life for him. So they were very dear to Paul. Now here's the other, and we're only doing the ladies, okay? There's a lot of people here in Romans chapter 16. I'm only highlighting the ladies because we're ladies, right? So here's some of them. Greet Mary, who bestowed much labor on us. So we don't know what she did, but she labored, okay? God knows what she did. We have no idea what she did. But this should encourage us, because when we labor for the Lord, guess what? God knows what we're doing. Have you ever been doing something and thought, why do I even do this? Who cares? Who's going to know? No one's going to come. God knows. He knew about Mary. He had it written down in the Bible. This is not Jesus' mother, okay? This is Mary. Miriam, the Hebrew name, Miriam, was a very, 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 very common name, okay? So there are a lot of Marys. It would be like, Jane or Sue today. The very common names that we have. Here's two other ones. Salute Tryphena and Tryphosa, who labor in the Lord. Now, a lot of commentaries say that they were sisters because they're mentioned together, and their names kind of rhyme, so it sounds like that their parents kind of named them like that. Some people do that with their kids. I know my mother named me and my sister so that we would have the same initials, JMP. And she named us J names because my dad is John, so we all have the J from his name, and we had the same initial JMP. So anyway, they probably did that back then. It does kind of rhyme, Tryphena, Tryphosa. The first 5 letters are the same, right? So these are sisters who are laboring. Again, we don't know what they did. Okay, it's not detailed what they did, but they did something. And then he says, salute the beloved Persis, which labored much in the Lord. So all 4 of these ladies, Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis, the big thing about them is just they labored. We don't know what they did. But God knows what they did. And it was so important that Paul greeted them. Okay? So never think that your labors are in vain. 1 Corinthians 15:58 is one of my favorite verses. Your labor is not in vain in the Lord, whatever it is. Whatever we're called to do. Now look at this one in verse 13. Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. So here we're talking about, Rufus is there, but he also talked about his mother, and he said, and mine. Now he doesn't mean salute his mother, but what he's saying is Rufus' mother was kind of like his mother. That's what he was saying, okay? Paul is saying Rufus' mother was very much a mother figure to him. That's what he means. Now, who is Rufus? Well, he's actually mentioned. Mark chapter 15, verse 21. And they compel one Simon a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. So Rufus' father is the one that bore Jesus' cross. So Rufus' mother would be the wife of Simon the Cyrenian that bore Jesus' cross. Okay? So where is Cyrene, or the Cyrenians? Well, you have Egypt here, okay, and then Cyrenia is here. It's modern day Libya. Libya is there today. Okay? Here's y'all know I love maps. So anyway, I like to put them all in here. But Cyrene, you see Libya. So this is basically North Africa. So Simon the Cyrenian, why was he in Jerusalem during Passover? Well, he was Jewish. So he had gone to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and he was yanked out of the crowd by the Romans. He was probably a big guy. I'm just thinking. And they got him to help Jesus bear the cross. I doubt he would have been a little guy, right? They just probably scanned the crowd and said, hey, get him. I would picture him being tall and strong, and they were like, get him and get him to help. So now think about Simon, and we don't even know her name, right? So she's the wife of Simon and the mother of Rufus. But don't you think this whole family was impacted by this event? And don't you think that later, how did Paul know so much about the crucifixion? Well, he had first-hand knowledge, right? He knew Simon and his wife and the family. Don't you think they sat many times with him and say, oh, you have no idea what it was like that day? Can't you hear them recounting the whole story to the Apostle Paul? They lived it. He was right there with Jesus. So how did Paul know that so well when he wasn't there? Because God provided them to teach Paul. And that's why they were so important to him way later in his life. And probably by this time, when he's writing Romans, it's quite possible that Simon maybe passed away, but his wife, whom we don't know her name, Rufus's mother, she's still alive. And then the last one's here, salute Philologus. So that's a man, this one. Julia Nereus, this is a guy, but his sister. So we have two ladies here. We have Julia and we have the sister of Nereus. this is a guy here. Olympus, it's a guy, and all the saints which are with them. So we have two more here, Julia and Nereus' sister. And he didn't say, he just says salute them. So they're mentioned. What did they do? I don't know. But Paul mentioned them. And they were dear to him. He mentioned them. So here's the whole list. Okay. Phoebe, Priscilla, of course, Aquila, Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, Rufus's mother, Julia. And they left out Nereus' sister. Nereus, his sister. I think it's. Is it on here? I thought it was on here. Nope. Anyway, that's the other one, Nereus' sister. So that's all the ones that he's talking about that are ladies here in Romans 16. And they helped him with his great ministry. So it just shows us that no one is like in a vacuum. Anyone who is, serving the Lord. You've got people helping you somehow. You have supporters like Phoebe. They use the word benefactor. You got supporters. You got people who pray for you. You got people who, I can only speak to you about my ministry of Light for Israel. I have a lot of supporters. I have churches, but I have a lot of individuals. About half of my supporters are just people that I know, that I have known over the years. They're like, hey, my church doesn't support you, but I want to support you. And they're supporters, they're individuals. And then I have people that write me and they say, I can't send you any money, but please put me on the mailing list. And I mail them the prayer letter, and they always pray about it. And I have a lot of elderly people. They're like, they'll send me $5 or $10 or something like that. So we want to have some kind of part, but we're on limited income. We don't have hardly anything. And I'm like, that's okay. And they're on the prayer list. And then I have people who are like, we want to give the Bibles out. And I just met two new people at the 4-day focus, a lady who's a chaplain in Chattanooga, and she got, I don't know, 20 or 30 Bibles. I said, here, we start with these, and if you give those out, I'll send you some more. And then another lady who works in West Palm Beach, Florida, and she has a ministry among Jewish assisted living places, and she wanted a lot of the scriptures to give out. So I'm getting her shipment together. So see, there's people like that are actually giving the Bibles. And so there's a lot of different people that help me in the ministry, some praying, some financially, some who are giving the Bibles out. So I'm sure Paul had the same kind of thing. Some did this, some did that, others did this over here. But no one operates in a vacuum. And we need many people in the work of the gospel. And everybody can do something. God gives us all gifts. And one of these days I'm going to teach on the spiritual gifts. He gives us all gifts. He gives us talents, which are natural talents, like singing, playing the piano, whatever. I don't have any talents like that. But then he also gives spiritual gifts, and those are different. Only Christians can have spiritual gifts. Lost people can have talents, right? I mean, millions of lost people have talents. That is natural born, mainly from our parents, and then we can improve it by using it more. But spiritual gifts, only Christians have spiritual gifts. So But we all have something, and most of us have more than one. It's just a matter of finding it, figuring it out, and then using it, using it for the Lord. So, do y'all have any questions on these people?